Hello and welcome. I'm James Milan, and thanks for joining us for this moderated debate on question number 2 on this year's state ballot, and that concerns the expansion of charter schools. For this debate, we are lucky to have a couple of advocates in the studio. I'm going to introduce them first, and then I will briefly describe the format of the debate, and we will jump into it. To my left, and representing the proponents of the ballot question, is Julia Mejía. Born in the Dominican Republic, Julia is the first person in her family to graduate from high school and attend college. Julia's early life experience advocating on behalf of non-English speaking parents fueled her devotion to serving youth and families and raising awareness of issues affecting communities of need. She is currently the Director of Families and Community Engagement for the Massachusetts Charter Public School Association, or the MCPSA. And to my right, her left, is Linda Hanson, who will be arguing in opposition to question number 2. Linda has been an educator for 25 years and currently works as a district elementary literacy coach in the Arlington Public School system. Her work centers on ensuring that teachers have the tools and expertise they need to implement the Common Core English language curriculum. She's also a past president of the Arlington Education Association. Thank you both for being here. And now a brief rundown of how the proceedings will go. After initial opening statements of 1 minute each, we will jump into a series of questions that I will ask in alternating fashion between the two advocates. The person I ask the question of will have 2 minutes to respond, and then the other advocate will have 1 minute of rebuttal time. And we will go through 10 questions in that way, and then the two advocates will have an opportunity to ask 2 questions each of the other. And in that case, the respondent will have 2 minutes to answer, and the person who asked the question will have 30 seconds to rebut. We will finish with a closing statement of 1 minute each from each of the advocates, and we will be done. So without further ado, I would like to invite you to give your opening statements, and we will start with you, Linda.
Thank you very much. Thanks, James, and thanks to ACMi for putting on this debate. I'm a public school teacher here in Arlington with 25 years experience, and I strongly believe that people should vote no on question 2 because it will fundamentally destabilize the public school system. This ballot question was written in a way that pits parents against parents and teachers against teachers. Because there are no provisions for additional funding, the only way to fund new charter schools is to take money away from traditional public schools. As it is, our public school system is woefully underfunded. A nonpartisan budget commission found that the legislature falls short in its commitment to adequately fund our schools by $1 billion a year. The governor and legislature made a promise to provide a quality education for all students in the Commonwealth. Rather than wasting our energy fighting over the charter school cap, we need to spend our time working together to convince our elected officials that it's time to provide the funding to make that promise a reality.
Thank you very much. You have 1 minute.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Excited to be here. So, as you mentioned, my name is Julia Mejía, and I am the first person in my family to graduate high school. My mom did not make it beyond 5th grade. So for me, this conversation around public education is both personal and professional. And it's deeply rooted in the sense of social justice and making sure that that when it comes to public education, it's fair access to all, not just some who happen to live in certain neighborhoods. So for me, the conversation is the wrong debate to be having, but here we are forced, despite all of the work that we have done with parents across the state and trying to find a resolution. The unfortunate part is that our legislators were unable to come to a space where families felt like it would work for them. So here we are having to choose between systems, when in reality we know that at the end of the day, this conversation is not supposed to be about one or the other, but really how are we going to dismantle an entire system to ensure that everyone has fair access to public education. And I vote yes.
Thank you very much. We're now going to start with the series of questions I mentioned, and I wanted to clarify before we begin that charter schools are public schools, obviously, and for the purposes of this debate, I will be referring to the two systems as charter schools and district schools. We are going to begin with directing the first question to you, Julia, and that is, in Massachusetts, charter school funding is based on the idea that the money follows the child. In order to mitigate some of the impact of districts of losing students to charter schools, the state reimburses the district for some of that loss. The question is, does this funding formula make sense? If you don't think it does, explain how you would change it. And in either case, please give us your reasoning.
Yeah, I guess I should first start off by saying, James, that I'm here representing the parent voice. So when it comes to numbers and funding and things of that nature, I know those are important, but as parents, that for me is not really something that I preoccupy myself with. But to answer the question in regards to funding, the bottom line is that our children are being educated with the same pot of money. So it doesn't really matter if it goes to the district or it goes to the charter sector, right? Because the money follows the child. And so I believe that there is no real need to change the funding formula. What we need to do is increase the amount of funding that neighborhoods like in the urban epic centers and gateway cities have additional funding. That's the only change that I would make in the funding formula, is to add more so that more families can have access to the type of education that they deserve.
Thank you very much. Linda, 1 minute rebuttal.
Yeah, thank you. I would completely agree with Julia that we need more funding, absolutely. And I think funding is really at the heart of this issue. While it's true that the funding does follow the child, not all of the costs follow the child. There are a lot of fixed costs that remain behind. Last year, according to the Department of Education, $450 million left traditional public schools for charter schools, and that was after the reimbursement was factored in. If question 2 passes, and with as little as 6 years, that could be another $1 billion. Elected officials across the state, the mayor of Boston, Senator Elizabeth Warren, the Mass Municipal Association, 150 school committees across the state are against question 2 because of this funding issue. In Arlington, we lost $100,000 last year just for 8 students going out to charter schools. So I really think fundamentally we can't afford to fund charter schools this way.
Thank you very much. But on to the next question, and this directed to you, Linda. The Yes on 2 campaign states that, quote, every parent deserves to choose the best public schools for their children. The question is whether you agree or disagree with this statement and why.
So James, I think there's no easy answer to that question. And the fact of the matter is that because of the current funding formula, one parent's choice takes away resources and choices from another family. What do you tell the parent of a traditional public school child when they lose their science or art or music class because of the lost funding? What do you tell a parent of a preschool child on a waiting list of 15,000 when they don't have access to a preschool spot because we don't have adequate funding in education? I think both sides, charter school parents and traditional public school parents, need to fight for the resources that all students need to be successful. And while full funding is not everything, until we get adequate funding, we're just robbing Peter to pay Paul. And I also believe that to tell parents that they need to advocate for charter schools to fill every available seat that's available, because that also will help more parents to be able to make the selection that is best for them.
Okay, thank you. Julia.
The idea that money's being taken away, it feels to me as though the choices that I'm making are taking away from your opportunities. And I understand that concept, but what I find to be confusing is that the money is being used to educate children who live in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, children whose parents are also taxpayers, right? So the money's not being funneled to Thailand or being used in other ways. Those dollars are being used to educate our children. So that I have a hard time understanding how that is a drain. And it's not as though charter public schools are welfare cheese and we're getting handouts. This is a right that was that we have to have access to quality education. So it's not like taking away from you just because our kids are trying to just get an adequate education, just the basics that so many families in other neighborhoods have without having to think about it twice.
Thank you. Moving on to the next question, and this will be directed to you, Julia. The No on To campaign challenges the notion that, quote, public charter schools do no harm to school districts. Could you explain the rationale behind that statement? What's the reasoning behind the idea that public charter schools don't harm school districts?
Just what I said earlier. So the families that are attending our schools live in the neighborhoods that in the cities that they serve. So it's just a matter of the governance structure. That's really the bottom line here. The harm it happens in our district schools when children are graduating from school unable to read and write. But yet no one talks about that harm. The harm is focused in and lasered in on issues around funding. And while I understand that, I also know that not one single red cent is going to change the current situation that we find ourselves in urban epicenters and gateway cities. Because when it comes to educating poor children of color, the desire and the political will is not there, because here it is 60 years later, even 40 years later more specifically, since the white flight occurred, and we're still having a conversation about public education. So what happens to the harm was already done to families and parents who've graduated unable to read. So therefore the workforce that we're talking about isn't prepared. So what we have to do in really thinking about this is that public education in our district side and in some neighborhoods, well, that's where the harm is being done. It's not about charter public schools doing harm to the funding situation. I think the conversation about the money, I find it to be offensive as a recipient of a charter public school. My daughters are thriving in the sector. So, and I know lots of families, and there's lots of people on the waiting list who are looking for a way out. And I think that we keep going back to conversations that make us feel as though we should be so lucky that people are giving us access to a quality education.
Linda.
So I guess I would respond, I'm kind of thinking about two different directions here. So just for Arlington with the funding. So we have only 8 students that leave our Arlington district schools to go to charter schools, and $100,000 follows those students there. Mm-hmm. That's 1.5 teachers, or that's enough money to fully fund full-day kindergarten TAs for our students. Mm-hmm. 8 students, we can't, they don't take 1.5 teachers worth of work with them when they leave. So we are actually out that $100,000. Now, a lot of districts have a lot bigger number taken away, 6 or 7 million for the city of Somerville, 150 million for Boston Public Schools. So I think, again, we just have to keep coming back to the point that when schools are inadequately funded and we pull funds away from one sector, then again, it's just diminished funding for everybody. So, and I think a lot of the fixed costs that remain behind are things like the lights in the schools and the heat, and that doesn't change just because a student leaves.
Cut you off there.
Sure.
But we will move on to the next question, and this is for you, Linda. Mm-hmm. The statute that authorizes charter schools in Massachusetts lays out a number of purposes for those institutions, which include, among other things, stimulating innovation, providing viable educational alternatives, and increasing accountability. Do you believe that charter schools are fulfilling these purposes in our state?
So stimulating innovation, I think there definitely are some innovations that are happening in charter schools, just like there are innovations happening in traditional public schools. What I don't think is happening is much in the way of sharing of those practices. I don't understand, one of the things I don't understand is if innovation is really one of the primary purposes of charter schools, why some charter school teachers have to sign confidentiality agreements that they can't share what's happening within a charter school to anyone outside of the charter school. So that doesn't make sense to me. And I think that I'm going to ask you again for those, for the other two things.
Providing viable alternatives, increasing accountability.
So providing viable alternatives, again, I believe that charter schools do provide another alternative, just like many traditional public schools. And I think that the accountability that's there, everyone's accountable these days. There's 5 levels of schooling depending on your test performance outcome. Traditional public schools are very accountable. Charter schools are accountable too, the same level system, and they're accountable to the State Department of Education that oversees them. Some of them have been put on probation and some of them have been closed. I don't see that they increase the amount of accountability, though, for traditional public schools.
Okay, thank you. Julia?
Thank you. So in terms of innovation, every charter school is uniquely different. So there are some schools that focus on teaching math and English through music. There's schools that focus on Afrocentric curriculums. So that in particular, and again, across the state, every school is different. But in Boston, which is the city that I live in, out of all of our charter schools, there's something for everyone. So in terms of innovation, they're looking at ways to educate kids differently. And then I also think in terms of accountability, as we know, there's this discussion about whether or not charter schools are held accountable to the local districts. But in actuality, they're held accountable to the state. So there is a lot of oversight. If a charter public school is not performing, they get shut down. And so what I would love to see is more of that accountability on the district side. I want to know how my dollars are being used and how that looks like.
I've got to stop you there. Sorry. But you've got another question coming at you right now.
Okay.
Do charter schools do a good job serving English language learners?
Yes.
And what is the evidence to support your reasoning?
Right. So there's a lot of misconceptions that charter public schools don't serve English language learners or students with disabilities. And this is from my own personal experience and my professional experience, that one of my nieces is both an English language learner and who has a learning disability. And with a short period of time, by being enrolled in her charter public school, she was able to learn how to speak English at a shorter amount of time than my niece, who was in a traditional district school. So just based on what I observed, that's why I started working in this field, was because I saw the results that my niece was getting for free, that I didn't have to pay out of pocket. And she had a learning disability, and I felt as though I lived in the suburbs because she was coming home with speech therapists, apparatuses, all of these things to support her learning. So charter public schools go beyond a call of duty to ensure that students are learning, and we have smaller classrooms and our longer school days, and because of our structure and our routines, students who are on the spectrum are able to acclimate into the classroom. And we don't send our kids to separate classrooms. Our kids are educated in an inclusion setting. And the other thing in terms of supporting English language learners and SPED is that our kids come into our schools performing at 2 to 3 grade levels below. And upon entering, they come in with a whole kit of an IEP. Sometimes they may not even be on an IEP. And within years, and this is from my own personal experience and things that I have heard from parents, is that those IEPs, those services are reduced because they no longer need them. But in the district schools, what's happening is that they hold on to those IEPs and they hold on to those services because that's how you get money. And in Boston in particular, the DOJ had to come in because our kids were not being served or educated.
Thank you.
So I'm certainly not going to argue that charter schools don't serve English language learners. I know that they do. But I will argue that I don't think they serve the same English language learners. I don't believe they have the same number of recent immigrants and older students that come with low levels of literacy. And I'm also going to strongly argue that they don't serve the same number or the same percentage of students. If you take the 3 largest cities across the state, Boston, Springfield, and Worcester, the traditional public schools serve 2 to 3 times the number of non-native English speakers as the charter schools. When you look at a school like the Brook Charter School in Boston, they serve less than 1% of English language learners, while the city of Boston has 30% English language learners. The Mystic Valley Charter School in Malden serves less than 2% English language learners, and the city of Malden has a 19% ELL population. So I don't think they serve them in the same numbers or the same kind of students.
Thank you. Linda, what are the appropriate performance standards for charter schools And do you believe that district public schools are and or should be held to the same standards as charter schools?
So I think in terms of the appropriate performance standards, I would argue that the system of accountability across the state should be changed, but I feel like that's a whole other topic and a whole other discussion. But I will say they certainly shouldn't be held to any, charter schools should not be held to any different standards than the traditional public schools. And I think that, because they have kind of looser regulations around things, they are able to set a class limit size. They don't have to fill a seat if a student leaves. They don't have to take new students that come along in high school. Because they have these certain other kinds of looser regulations, that they should be held to higher performance standards or performance standards that are really clearly set out. And if they're not clearly met, then there should be real conversations about why they're not being met. So again, because I think the whole idea is innovation, looser regulations, a chance to innovate, hopefully incubate some new ideas that will serve all students, they should at least be held to the same accountability standards, if not even higher.
Julia?
So I think, I have some extra time. Well,
You don't get my time.
So I think in terms of accountability and performance, the question that that comes to mind more specifically is what's not happening on the district side in terms of accountability, because as far as I know, charter public schools are held to the highest level of performance in terms of student outcomes, in terms of our family engagement work, and are obviously, as you know, my daughter goes to the Edward Brooke, and just yesterday I did a Spanish only conversation for the parents that were there. So I have to say that is also something that I need to debut, and the reason why district schools have more students, I would hope so, is because the district is larger. So there's something that we need to look at around the number of students that end up in our schools. But I think in terms of performance, we're
Sorry
going to
cut you off. Julia, one theory states that charter schools are granted more autonomy in exchange for more accountability, and I think this is something Linda was just referring to. Should district schools have greater autonomy and accountability?
Absolutely.
If so, how can that happen?
So that to me, I think, is the $1 million question on the table, right? Because we know that schools who, at least in the charter side, they have longer school days. So that's a flexibility and autonomy that they have. They're able to dictate their curriculums. The length of the school year is also longer because our kids need to be in schools longer because we're getting them under very underperforming situations, and they're already 2 to 3 grade levels beneath. So I believe that absolutely the district needs to step it up. And I'm so lost in that thought. But what was the question again? Because I was like,
just whether district schools, in fact, should have greater autonomy
Absolutely.
and accountability themselves, and how to do that.
And that's a great example of being able to provide the district schools with the tools that they need so that they can better serve families in certain districts. So that flexibility and that autonomy will provide that, and also to hire and fire. I think this is if you ask any parent out there, the issue, I know that we're being pitted against each other, but when you look at the union contract and when you look at everything has to be through bureaucracy, and there are some teachers who are so completely, and not all, because I have a lot of friends who are educators, but there are some teachers out there who have no regard for students, and they'll say to you, I'm going to get a check whether you learn or not. And those are the sort of things that if a principal had more say about whether or not a teacher is performing, then we would feel, as parents, we would feel a little bit more confident that we know that our kids are getting their money's worth and that they're going to be better prepared. So I think that the flexibility and the autonomy helps school leaders be able to better produce the results that we need. And I think a longer school day really helps.
Thank you. Linda.
So I guess I'm just going to say that in response to Julia's mention of the union contracts and teacher tenure, for instance, that supervision does not stop at the 10-year door. And I think that every teacher is accountable for every day they work in a traditional public school, from their first 3 years when they're basically employees at will, to once they receive tenure. That supervision, especially under the new educator evaluation system, happens all the time, and that there are real consequences for people that aren't doing a great job. And you also mention just kind of an instance where a teacher might have said or done things that are harmful to a student. And I think that a lot of the no excuses discipline policies in some of the charter schools have also shown to be pretty detrimental to children's self-esteem and their ability to kind of feel good about themselves and have a strong learning environment.
Thank you. Getting near the end here. According to the Massachusetts Department of Elementary and Secondary Education's website, there are more than 32,000 students on charter school waiting lists for this coming year, the 2016-2017 school year, or the current year, excuse me. Explain how and why this ballot initiative either will or will not address the needs of these students.
So I'm going to answer that question by saying that you do hear an awful lot about that number. That number's been, and the number has changed. It's been 37,000, it's been 32,000, but it's a big number. But what you don't hear much about is charter schools not filling the seats that open up during the year and not filling the seats that open year after year as students move through the program. The vast majority of charter schools lose students along the way. They graduate fewer students than they started in that group of, in that class when it first began. The Boston Prep Charter School, for instance, started out with a class of 87 in 6th grade and graduated a class of 45. They lost 50% of their class, but they didn't fill those seats after students had left. And I do understand that the law says that for charter schools, again, this autonomy that we were talking about. So if you have a 6-year program from 1st to 6th grade, the law states that you only have to fill students in half of those years. So in the first 3 years of the program, for instance, you don't have to fill them at all at the high school level. But if there's such a demand and such a so much concern about this waiting list, I don't understand why parents don't demand that every single seat that's made available is filled, no matter when it happens during the year and no matter when it happens year over year. I think if parents understood this practice, they would demand that every seat be made available.
Thank you. Julia.
So let's talk a little bit about that wait list, because I think that has become my obsession. Every day people call me, hey, are there any seats available? And I think the question really you have to think about is, why are families deciding to opt out of the traditional sector? And why are families choosing MECO? Why are families taking on 3 jobs? So that they don't have to endure the consequences of being in a school that is underfunded and undersupported, and there's not enough support for teachers to be able to do right by the kids, right? So there's a lot of frustration around that wait list, those 30,000 students who are looking for a way out. I'll tell you really quick about why a lot of our students happen to leave our schools is because we do such a great job, and then they end up going into the exam schools in traditional, in Boston and other areas of throughout the state. So our kids are able to perform.
Sorry,
so
Julia.
Well.
Time's up. Question 2, Julia, if approved, would allow charter school enrollment to expand by up to 1% of the total statewide public school enrollment each year, a figure that works out to be about 9,500 additional students in the next school year. So please describe how you see this impacting 3 different kinds of school districts: urban, suburban, and rural.
So let's look at this really quick, because there is a witch hunt out there that we're going to charterize the state of Massachusetts, right? So we're talking about up to 12 charter public schools. That doesn't necessarily mean that all 12 charter public schools are just going to pop up. So I think that that's something that we need to be really clear about, and that these schools are going to be going into the districts that are the lowest 25% performing, so that these are areas where there are a high need to provide alternate choices, right? So the way that I see this rolling out is really making sure that parents and communities have a voice in what that looks like, so that charter public schools are not just popping up just for the sake of popping up and being competitors of the district, but really looking at how they can be collaborators and looking at ways that we can innovate around English language learners and SPED, and really being deliberate and intentional with how we take the next wave of the charter sector, so that we're working to support the district and not being in competition with. And so I think that in areas like Boston, for me, the neighborhood that I live in, there are very limited choices, right? So I can't afford to live in Jamaica Plain, the South End. These are the more affluent areas. I can't even afford to live in Arlington, let alone Newton. So driving over here was a little bit overwhelming for me because I know that I will never live here, right? And because this is where the schools have the highest, because basically where your zip code is, it dictates the type of education that you're going to get. So I think that the 12 schools are going to end up in neighborhoods and in areas in which there's a bigger need. And I think that, for me, this goes back to what I said in my opening comments, is that this conversation is personal and professional. My mom did not finish the 5th grade. She works at Babson as a food handler. And so I would love to see that in the rural area, because that's what you get in the gateway cities too as well.
Thank you.
So I'm going to add to this question just the thought that question 2 allows 12 new charter schools a year, every year, with no end going forward. And only if there are more than 12 charter school applications does the law direct the State Department of Education to target the lowest performing areas to cite these schools. So I think there is a real concern that this law would allow charter schools to be cited anywhere in the state. It also would eliminate the 9% and 18% net school spending cap. So a charter school basically could take over an entire school district. So I think the way this law is written, while we can all speculate about where the schools might be cited, it opens it up for them to be cited anywhere, anytime across the state, and it eliminates important protections.
Okay, thank you. And we are up to the last question in this series, and it's directed to you, Linda. Please tell us one point on which you agree with the opposing advocate, and the most important thing, as far as you're concerned, with which you disagree.
So I'm going to start out by saying I think right away it's really clear that Julie and I both agree that our school system is underfunded and that we need to work together, not against each other, to ensure better funding. And I think probably where we disagree is that I think charter schools have a mixed record. There are some strong ones and there are some weak ones, just like traditional public schools. So I think that while the charter school side, I think with this question, is arguing the position that all charter schools are good, all charter schools are strong, offer a stronger alternative than traditional public schools. And I simply don't agree with that. I feel like there are schools that are better and not as good for every student on the traditional public school side and on the charter school side. And I really am concerned that this particular question takes away important protections around funding, so that it would really destabilize public funding if it went into effect. So I'm going to say that I think we agree on the need for more funding, and that we possibly disagree on the fact that kind of the state of traditional public school education and opportunities, and that there are waiting lists in traditional public schools as well. So there are good schools on both sides.
Julia.
So I have to agree. I think that from the moment we started really getting to know each other before we went on air, that we felt a sense of commitment to the conversation, that this is not really about either one or the other, and that we really care about the bigger picture. So I think that you hit it right on the nail. I think that where we may disagree is the governing structures of how and where our kids get educated. So for me, because I'm not an educator, I really don't care if it's a traditional school or a charter school. I really don't care about that. Mm-hmm. But I think that this conversation is so deeply rooted on picking between two different structures. And I think that as a parent and as someone who is new into the education conversation, I am the Erin Brockovich of this, because I'm learning as I go. I just don't understand how, I disagree that parents really care that if it's a district or a charter. I think that we don't really care about it as much as folks think.
Thank you. And that wraps up this section of the debate. So now we're going to proceed to the next series of questions, which, as I mentioned before, will permit each of you to ask a question of the other. And the respondent will have 2 minutes to respond, and then the person who asked the question will have a 30-second rebuttal opportunity.
Sure, thank you. So, Julia, I've heard that charter schools raise millions of dollars above and beyond the Chapter 70 money that they get in per pupil funding from the state. The Brook Charter School that we've mentioned before in Boston is just one example of this. And on their website, I found this list of, just columns and columns of donors that has to equal well over $1 million. Mm-hmm. Is this typical of charter schools, and is this a recognition that the current funding level from the state is inadequate? And I guess basically the question is, can you help me understand the role of private funding in charter schools?
Yeah, absolutely. So as I mentioned, my daughter is at the Brook, and I see that every single dollar that they raise is actually in the classroom, because she's in the first grade, almost reading at a third grade level. And so for me, I know I'm getting my money's worth, even though it's free. I know every single dollar is being used to educate my child, and that is a relief. And I know that might upset some folks because other people have to pay for those type of scenarios, and that probably is why people are so upset about the charter conversation. But as far as I know, charter public schools have to pay for their own facilities, and they have to raise a lot of monies just so that they can maintain their doors open, whereas district schools, in addition to getting state funding, they also get local city taxes, and they, on top of that, are able to raise money and do fundraisers, because depending on what neighborhood you happen to live in, there's some really active parents who have access to wealth and opportunity, and because of that, they're able to put on these extravagant fundraisers and raise millions of dollars so that their kids can have state-of-the-art equipment. Whereas in areas like Boston, where the Brook happens to be at, there aren't parents who are highly engaged in that capacity, don't have access to that wealth and opportunity. So having funders to help us ensure that our lights stay on is really to me, I have to say I'm grateful for the fact that we have so much money coming in, because there's so much work that needs to be had to ensure that our kids are being well educated. Now, I could see if my daughter was coming home without homework, and if my daughter was not learning anything, and those dollars were being funneled to a third world country, then maybe I might have an issue with that fundraising. But traditional public schools also raise funds, and they're still, in terms of result, there's very little.
Very much.
Thank you.
30 seconds.
Yeah, and I'm just going to say, I think we very much agree on the fact that the discrepancy in funding shouldn't exist, and that everybody should have an equal and high level of funding. But there's over $1 million here. That's not like a typical PTO fundraiser, and I just feel like if this is part of the charter formula, that it takes all of this extra foundation and private wealth and corporate wealth going into those schools to allow them to have the results that they do, then that's something that should be talked about.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So could I ask a question?
You get to ask a question.
Why, so do I ask my own question? Do I ask, because I'm intrigued as to why the district schools aren't doing the same thing. And you have to wonder why that is. So that's just something for you can marinate on. But my question specifically is this about jobs? Because parents are really confused about this fight. And so what I have heard, right, that the unions are all about trying to protect their jobs and the status quo. And parents are a little bit confused as to why this conversation is being led by people who don't live in our neighborhoods, who have very little lived experience, and but you care about us, but we just are confused as to, is this about jobs. Are you protecting jobs at the end of the day? Because if you don't care about governance structure, what do you care about?
Okay, so I feel like I heard a couple questions in there, and I guess I'm going to focus on the union piece and the jobs piece.
Yeah.
So I'm a 25-year career educator. I'm a lifelong union member, and very proud of the job that unions have done in Massachusetts to create a viable, stable, high-achieving school system. It's one of the best in the country, and it certainly competes well on an international stage as well. And I feel like what unions have done in this country is create the learning environment, worked hard to get class sizes so that we can meet the needs of students, have appropriate number of special educators and English language teachers and social workers to provide that good environment for all students to learn. I think the reason that teachers, and we're teachers, I'm a union member, but I'm a teacher, I'm a career educator. We work all across the state of Massachusetts, and we care about the education of all students in the urban areas, in rural areas, in suburban areas. And we feel like this charter ballot question 2 is bad policy. It's bad education policy that will harm and destabilize the whole kind of public school system. So I think that's what we care about, and that's why I'm involved in this fight, and that's why I think a lot of my colleagues are involved in this fight.
Oh. So it's not about jobs.
So you have 30 seconds.
So no, I'm still confused. I just want to know if it's really, at the end of the day, the bottom line is, it has nothing to do with jobs. You're not going to lose any jobs as a result of this conversation, because parents are really confused by this.
You can share your the 30 seconds. You
My
have
13 seconds?
Yeah, because I just want to be able to say, no, it has nothing to do with jobs.
I think it has to do with the funding of the overall education system. It doesn't have to do with anyone being afraid of losing a job. It's
Okay.
the funding.
Thank you. We're going to move on. You have one more question each. Your turn, Linda.
Okay, so Boston Mayor Marty Walsh, Senator Elizabeth Warren, and more locally, State Senator Will Brownsberger have come out in opposition to question 2, saying it goes too far and would wreak havoc on the public school system finances. Why do you disagree with these charter school supporters?
So first of all, and this is what I said when I first started talking, is that we're having the wrong conversation. And question 2, nothing's going to change the deep systemic racial issues that exist in urban education. So this conversation, question 2 is not going to change that for people of color, right? Whether they lift the cap or not, the demons that we have to face and fight have nothing to do with question 2. So let me just, I don't have any grand thoughts that this is going to change our situation. What I will say, though, it'll give access and opportunities to families who have very little access to wealth and resources. So that's why I disagree, because I don't believe it's fair to shut families out and create your own separate privatization by just the mere fact of where you happen to live. So my concern in all of this is that there are a lot of people who are having this conversation, and many of which have no skin in the game, which means they don't have any kids of their own. They don't have to juggle 3 or 4 jobs to decide whether or not they're going to send their kid to a private school or they're not going to put food on the table. So for me, this conversation goes back to Marty really recognizing, because he is the mayor of Boston, and this is where this conversation is going to be deeply impacted, is recognizing that there are families who know that at the end of the day, they can't afford to give their children the type of education that they deserve. So that's why I disagree. And I do agree, though, on one part, is that the way the ballot was written, there's nothing for the district schools, right? So what we need to do is, once this ballot is passed, if we really are about working together, I'm all about what happens after. To be honest with you, win or lose, at the end of the day, this conversation is not going to go away. So my concern is what happens after November the 8th, and what are we going to do to make sure that all families have access to the type of education that some folks have at their disposal.
Thank you.
And I guess my follow-up would just be that I think the efforts and the energy of the parents that you're talking about are misguided, in that I think the fight is really about the funding. And I think, yes, we need to work together on November 9th But I think this whole ballot question has just, taken up a whole lot of oxygen and a whole lot of time and energy and effort that could have been better spent working on figuring out how we're going to nail down the right amount of funding to adequately fund our schools.
Thank you. And we arrive suddenly at the last question, and it is yours to ask, Julia.
So when you talk about oxygen, I feel like I am dying to breathe to ensure that my daughter has access to the type of experiences that most people take for granted. So that oxygen for me is I see that as my ticket out of poverty, right? And so my question is, what can the teachers' unions do to ensure that we have a longer school day, right? That we have a longer school year, because we know that our kids are not performing at the level that they should. So what are you going to do? How are you going to, as a union rep, fight to make sure that the days are longer and that our kids get what they deserve?
So I think there are a lot of things that we can do. Again, it's not all about the funding, but it's a lot about the funding. And I feel like to have a longer school day, to have a longer school year, you can do creative things. You can bring in enrichment programs after school. You can hire other teachers. You can make it optional for teachers who aren't able to work a longer year. You can find other ways to extend the school year. So I think that there are lots of things that we can do together to work on this. The problem that you bring up is real. So I really do believe that parents everywhere should have good choices for their schools. But I think there are a lot of parents, even in Boston. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, that the Boston Teachers Association came out against question 2 also. So that's parents in Boston representing other parents in their communities that are against this particular bill as well. So again, I think there's a whole lot we can do to continue to improve the education that we offer all of our kids. And I couldn't agree with you more that every child deserves the same access to a high quality education.
Julia, 30 seconds.
30 seconds, are you sure? Wow, so I should have said this in my opening statements that I'm very passionate. And so sometimes I sound like I'm fighting, but I'm not, okay? I guess all I could say is that we keep going back to the money, and families who want access to a quality education don't care about the money. And I know the money is what's going to decide the type of education that we get, but I think that there needs to be a middle ground. And I think that when you talk about Arlington having...
Sorry, but here's the good news.
What?
You have a minute closing statement.
First of all, thank you for hosting. This was my first time doing this live, and you were a great person to do this with, so thank you for having me here. I think that, I'll say this is what I started out with, is that at the end of the day, this conversation is not about us. We know this. And it's not about the teachers. We know this. This conversation is something that this is the same conversation that we had, and it's just in a different outfit. So in the 60s, they gave us MECO, right? Now they give us charter schools. And in the 60s, it was poor whites against poor blacks. Now it's poor blacks against poor blacks and teachers. So we are constantly doing this, when in reality, we need to start working more collaboratively and recognizing that at the end of the day, money is important, but giving families the type of access to the type of education that they are seeking and voting yes on 2, for me, is about disruption. And we need to make sure that we do not maintain the status quo. And that is why I'm in this fight.
Thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks to you, James, and to ACMi for hosting this debate, and thanks too for Julia for engaging in this spirited debate with me. And I think we do share a lot of common core values. The current system of 80 charter schools, though, draws $450 million a year out of the traditional public school system. In 6 years, it could drain $1 billion a year. Question 2 would allow charter schools to open up anywhere in the state with no limits on how much money any one district could lose. Charter school supporters like Boston Mayor Marty Walsh and Senator Elizabeth Warren are against this bill because of the dire financial impact it would have on the public school system. Without raising the current cap, the state could double the number of seats in charter schools across the state and even add seats in Boston right now, today. The biggest problem facing families in Massachusetts is the underfunding of our education system. It hurts both charter and traditional public school students alike. All students deserve a high-quality education, and we need to work together to close the achievement gap. A rising tide lifts all boats. Please vote no on 2.
Okay. And with that, we will wrap up this debate. We are deeply grateful to Julia Mejía and to Linda Hanson for being here and engaging, as Linda said, in a spirited debate, and also one in which a lot of the issues involved here were aired extensively. So to you both, thank you very much. And we want to thank you also for joining us. And we want to remind you to get out there and vote on November 8th on this ballot question and the others as well. And we thank you for joining us on behalf of Arlington Community Media. This is James Milan. Thanks again.